right. Friends, degens, countrymen, lend me your ears, and let us talk about geographic decentralization today. This is going to be fun. So in case you zone out during part of my talk and or you're like so deep in the MEV circuit that you've read literally every piece of MEV literature ever, I'm going to say that a lot of what I'm talking about today is kind of synthesized into this post, which I highly recommend you read, reference, and circulate. So you can find this by just Googling geographical decentralization crypto. And please, if you miss something, read that or send it to your friends. Okay, I think it's always nice to start with a nice retrospective on the past and kind of where we've come to today as a space. So where are we? Well, if you walk around a lot of the after parties and events and things that people have going around this amazing conference, you'll hear that we are in a bear market. This is the first image that came up on Google when I Googled bear market. A lot of the pictures in this slide are just the first result on Google. So what is a bear market? A bear market is a condition in which securities prices, oh, that's dangerous, shout out Gary Gensler, fall 20% or more from a recent high amid widespread pessimism and negative investor sentiment. So, you know, arguably that's where we are in crypto, although 20%, they might need to update that a little bit. So we all know that bears are scary, and so are bear markets. And we're all afraid, right? There's a lot of fear in the room. I would say no, I'd say it's actually kind of nice. We have all the technical people here, we're building cool stuff. There's less VCs, no offense if you're a VC, I love VCs. You know, the ratio was a little off a few years ago. You know, bears can actually be quite cuddly and enjoyable. This is my stuffed bear collection. They accompany me everywhere I go, including to this conference. You know, I'm gonna talk about both kinds of bears today, both the cute and cuddly kind and the scary kind. Because it's important that in the bear market, we surround ourselves with cuddly, nice, fun bears and not the really scary bears. Okay, so what does this have to do with you? Well, this is a picture of you. If you don't feel this way on the inside, deep to your core, you probably came into the wrong room, and I think the Dow conference is on the other side of the building. So what are you? You are a consensus researcher. Yay! Maybe not, but today you can pretend you're a consensus researcher. You're a consensus researcher in the bear market. Oh no. So what are you going to do? Well, today I'm going to make the bear market really exciting for you as a consensus researcher, and I'm going to teach you how to win the Nobel Prize in 3 easy steps. You might not believe me. You might say, Phil, there's no Nobel Prize in consensus. That's for physical sciences, not things like computer science. But, you know, we'll get to that later in the talk. So, you know, if you can win the Nobel Prize, I think it'd be a pretty cuddly bear market for you. So what I'm saying is if you're a consensus researcher, please pay attention, because what I'm about to tell you, I think, is a very important piece of work that needs to be done, all joking aside. But joking not aside, it's going to win the Nobel Prize. Okay, so what is this important message I want to share to you, the consensus researcher? It's a very simple one. Byzantine fault-tolerant model, no, we're good, we're good. That's the no meme. What we want to look at are protocols that are geographically decentralized. So I want to convince you, whether you're a consensus researcher or just a dApp developer, L1 designer, mechanism designer, whatever you are, but let's talk about from the perspective of a consensus researcher first, that this property of systems, geographically decentralized systems, geographical decentralization, is probably the most important thing you could be studying from a practical impact perspective for crypto systems. And doing BFT research in crypto, well, it's like you're drunk at the bar and you're like playing darts, except the dartboard is the Nobel Prize, and you're missing it, you know? So like, let's hit the Nobel Prize. Okay, so why do we care about this property in crypto? Geographic diversity, decentralization, whatever you want to call it. Well, ostensibly, we care about this thing called decentralization. That's like the #1 meme in crypto. We all like to talk to each other about our decentralized projects and our decentralized future and all these great things. This is the first image that I found for decentralization on Google. So I think this is how people like to picture it in your mind. If you're centralized, there's a center. If you're decentralized, there's not. Pretty easy, right? Okay, so I wanted to find out how this relates to geography. So how do we think about geography when we design these systems? And in the last few days, I've gone to a lot of AI talks. Seems to be the new hot thing around SF. So I tried to ask ChatGPT to kind of do some of this hard work for me. So what is decentralization and why is geographic distribution important to decentralization? Unfortunately, this morning ChatGPT was down for some reason, and I waited until the last minute to make our slides. So all of you AI people that are saying like society is about to be transformed, what happens when Chat OpenAI has an error? Are we all like gonna die in our cars and stuff? I don't know. So anyway, so let's look at the geographic distribution of Ethereum today. So there's this paper coming out of the University of Toronto where they just talk about this issue in general, quantify it, and kind of explore this topic. And you can't see this because the contrast ratio on the screen is really bad, but maybe that's actually better because this is a heat map of where all the validators are located in the Ethereum network as of the writing of this paper, and 53.11% are in the US, 18.29% in Germany. If you could actually see the map, which I can on this slightly better screen, you could see various parts of Asia, Russia, and South America, and as well as Australia and South Africa also have a presence in the network, but kind of far less substantial today than the US's presence in the network. Why do we care about that? Why is that a good or a bad thing? So first I'm going to motivate the problem, and then I'm going to give you the three-step recipe to solve it and win the Nobel Prize. So the first reason we really care about this problem is regulations. So I'm not saying that we all have to share the view about whether regulations are good or bad, or even how to implement them, but I think we share the perspective, at least in this room, that we're trying to build global systems that kind of transcend any one set of actors, right? And so regulations and building systems that kind of have meta properties over the various regulations we have in the world is kind of a super important concern. Now, if you don't have geographic decentralization, what does that mean? That means all your nodes are potentially in one place or a small subset of places. Going back to this, we have US and Germany. So what does that mean? It means today US and Germany could get together and compel the validators to do something with the hash power of around 70% of the Ethereum network. So that's pretty scary. So we want to be diversified for regulations. We also care because we care about this thing called neutrality. So that's a big meme in crypto, and I would say like techno-libertarian circles in general. Like we want to be neutral, right? We don't want to think about hard ethical problems. We just want to build systems that like don't have to deal with those or reason about them. I'm trolling a little bit, but also not. And that's a picture of Switzerland. And Switzerland is a very beautiful country, and they've built that country through neutrality. Look at the prosperity. That's almost like a painting over there. So we want to be Switzerland in crypto. We want to be the neutral financial hub of the world. And if we're not geographically decentralized, unless it's to Switzerland, the kind of prospects of that seem weak. We also have a lot of use cases in crypto that inherently require geographic decentralization. So things like cross-border payments being one of the very successful use cases of Bitcoin and other currencies. If we don't have geo-decentralization, these use cases suffer for various reasons. Why else do we care? So nuclear war. Nuclear war is something that we've actually faced as a species in the last few years with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The escalation and the threat of nuclear destruction of our planet. One of the Ethereum Foundation's stated goals for the ETHL-1 system is to be able to withstand a nuclear war and continue to provide availability and safety in the aftermath of like a worldwide nuclear escalation. And this is done through robustness and distribution and through economic properties that incentivize people to run the system even after a nuclear war. So if we want to be robust, obviously we can't be centralized because what if the nuke hits our data center, then we're screwed. Okay, fairness. We all care about fairness, right? We all want to build fair systems. Someone said, Phil, do you want to build an unfair system? You know, maybe some people think I'd get very excited about that, but maybe that's not as much actually the case, right? Maybe we don't agree on what fairness means. So this was my first Google result for fairness. You can see there's a very confused looking like anamorphic thing with a magnifying glass. It's probably a deep statement on our disagreements on the exact technical notion of fairness to deploy in our systems, but maybe not, I don't know. But certainly it seems like unfair if all nodes are concentrated to one set of localities, no? It seems like the people outside those sets of localities lose input and control into the system. And so how can you have fairness if you don't have geo-distribution? It seems like the two are, at least in my subjective notion of fairness, opposed. Okay, I think the last one is network effects. So Peter Thiel has some sort of very famous anecdote about bridges and infrastructure in cities and why bridges make like cities more valuable because of network effects and therefore should be funded as public goods, et cetera. And we're in Silicon Valley, so I figured I would use that argument. But we do, in this space, want to build cooperation, right? We believe that value comes from cooperation, and in a purely rational sense, that means that geo-decentralized systems will be more powerful and more valuable than ones that are not, because they enable cooperation. So building a system that's isolated to the US or isolated to Europe or something like that, it limits the possibility for this collaboration to actually unlock value for our species. Okay, so you are the consensus researcher, and you might say, that's all great, Phil, but you're not telling me about my Nobel Prize. It seems very important, but I don't know how to tackle this problem. I don't know how to build geographically diverse systems. What do I actually do about this? So this is spicy, the recipe. So the first thing we're going to talk about is formally, what do we mean by geographic decentralization? So I'm going to give you a working definition. It's not a paper-published, battle-tested definition that I invite you all to collaborate with us on, but I think can already illuminate some core reasoning around kind of this property in networks. And then that's all I'm going to give you for free today. So steps 2 and 3 are up to you, you know. But now that we have this definition, and maybe that kind of starts to answer 2, are there useful metrics to study in practice? Are there more than one metric? Are there metrics that are contradictory with each other? And how do we design and evaluate new protocols against these metrics? So first, I want to give you some of my personal axioms. I'm not saying you have to share these, but these are my personal axioms on decentralization and what it means to crypto. So my first axiom is that the only decentralization that matters is decentralization of power. And in this case, I'm talking about economic power because these are economic systems. A lot of people like to look at definitions of decentralization that involve many other things like what hash rate do you have? How many validators do you have? How many validators can your consensus protocol support? What is the minimum deposit you need? Some of these are impactful on matters of power, but I would argue that really at its core, decentralization is about power. And the other forms, which are architectural, technical, logical, whatever you want to call it, decentralization, those will arise naturally. Those will be emergent properties if you have decentralized power. Because people want to cooperate, and in a decentralized power setting, that's kind of how you do it. So it should be a goal of our efforts as technologists and consensus researchers, you, the consensus researcher, to serve and protect decentralization of power through our technical definitions. These things need to harmonize with each other. They cannot have a gap or an issue in their correspondence. And the last axiom I have is a little kind of less of a sequitur from the previous 3, but decentralization of power must be global. So I think if you're truly talking about decentralizing power, for that to be meaningful in a crypto context, we have to be talking about the world. Okay, let's talk about our actual definition for economic decentralization. So we're going to introduce a few letters as definitions are wont to do. So first we have some game G, any kind of economic game mechanism, whatever you want to call it. Let's call its player set P of that game. And this game is being played remotely over a network. So the network, we're going to call it N. And we're going to choose an N where P's have basically latency that's sampled from a distribution of worldwide latency. Then we're going to take another network, N prime, and rather than sampling the latency, we're going to give all of these players in this network epsilon, or minimal latency to each other. Okay, so then we're going to take some player small p, which is just going to be some arbitrary rational player in P. So now what we're going to look at is kind of this ratio. So what this is saying on top is the expected profit of P playing G with network N prime. So this is the profit that P expects to make in an equilibrium of this game where the game is being played on network N prime. Equilibrium part is very important. The bottom kind of term is the expected profit of P under network N, which has like the real latency of the worldwide internet essentially. So this is something I informally call the geo-centralization coefficient, or like the rational pressure to co-locate with other participants in the system. So you want to kind of keep this as low as possible. So if this is high, it means you're making much more money in a case where there's like no latency in the system than you're making in a case where you kind of have geo-distributed latency. I'm not saying this definition is perfect, by the way. I'm sure y'all are going to have many questions for me about it later. And so what is this? This is an economic definition, right? We're talking about consensus, but now we have an economic definition. What just happened here? Well, that's how you win the Nobel Prize, because I Googled what they have it in, and they have it in economics. So you consensus researchers take note of that. Otherwise, you can't do it, you know? Otherwise, you can't do it. Okay, so now we have this definition. Let's try to talk about the intuition behind this definition and actually use it for something. And these are going to be two very oversimplified examples. So these are more for educational purposes, but I think they capture kind of what we're doing here. So let's think about two blockchains, one that has a 10 millisecond block time and one that has a 5-minute block time. Let's say they're using the same like block-based consensus algorithm. And let's consider this network setting, the network setting where many of the nodes in the network happen to, for some reason, be running in the same data center. This is a picture of Hetzner in Germany, which the meme states is where all of Solana is run out of. But it could be AWS in Ohio. I could have chosen AWS, you know, but Hetzner, it's a nice name. So on the left, we have, both sides, we have kind of all these nodes in Hetzner, and then another node outside the system. Maybe it's in Australia or one of those kind of grayed out areas on the map we saw, and it has slightly more latency to Hetzner, maybe 20 milliseconds of latency. So now let's just take a look at the expected profit of this node and kind of look at it for this player that has 20 milliseconds of latency. Because really what you want to do, you want to reason that for the worst player, this is kind of minimized. So you look at this kind of over all P because P is arbitrary. So let's look at this guy on the outside. And we can see that he's very sad. Why? Because if you're playing on network N prime, where kind of everyone has 0 latency, this person is able to, well, make a lot of money in both universes, right? But if you're now playing on a network with the latency labeled here, 20 milliseconds, on the left side, this user can no longer participate in the system, so their profit is 0. They physically can't produce a block because they can't communicate with the network fast enough. And on the right side, there's no difference, right? Because the 20 millisecond delay is not really going to affect the protocol much in a 5-minute block time. So what we end up here is mean versus cuddly teddy bears, right? Clearly, this is less geographically decentralized than that under this definition. So Solana, less geographically decentralized than ETH. Fight me after if you don't agree. Okay. Lastly, let's take a crypto example here. So this definition is not just useful for a consensus, but also for using other sub-protocols in consensus. So VCs love buzzwords, right? And they love, now it's MPC, FHE, and LLMs. Those are like the 3 that I'm hearing. It's like, oh, you know, like your pitch doesn't have MPC. Why not? Why don't you solve this problem through MPC? So in that case, like let's look at what does that actually mean to add MPC to something, and how does it affect your system in like an online protocol? So let's look at the two-party computation case, where in the latency network, we have 1 second of latency between the two parties. So we have 2 protocols here, an SGX protocol and an MPC protocol. So in the SGX protocol, the parties can each kind of have the function. They can each encrypt input to each other's SGXs, as well as provide it to their own SGX, and each securely obtain the result. It's kind of a trivial construction. In the MPC case, these parties will perform an MPC computation on a circuit which has both of their inputs as private inputs, private wires into the circuit, and they'll perform some sort of process between each other, some sort of likely interactive process where they'll both receive the result at the end. Oh, and I forgot this on the previous slide, but let's, to make it economic, say they each get 20 bucks for learning this. For some reason, this result is important to both of them. And on the left, they can get paid by having an attestation of the output, and on the right, they can get paid through kind of MPC smart contract mediation. Okay, so let's look at the same term for both of these systems. Well, in the SGX system, the only latency that matters is the latency of them sending their encrypted inputs to each other, which is a single network round of communication. In MPC, they have to perform many rounds of network communication, potentially, to kind of arrive at a final result. If these rounds take more than 1 second, we're kind of in the same situation we were before, where kind of MPC becomes geographically centralizing because these nodes are incentivized to co-locate to kind of increase the speed or feasibility in the extreme case of their MPC. Of course, I've given you some extreme examples, but this holds even for like marginal analyses on protocol changes against MEV distribution and things like that. So what have we concluded from that? SGX protocols can actually be more geographically decentralized than MPC. Crazy, right? Crazy? No, not crazy? Okay, great. Okay, so one more thing I have to say, which is you're ready to win the Nobel Prize, you're a consensus researcher, you really believe in geographic decentralization. Hopefully I've convinced you that this is an important property for all of humanity and for us to have in our systems. I'm not saying this comes for free or that this is a property that's easy to achieve. In fact, there are many forces in the world, and that's why this definition was designed, that are economic and otherwise in nature, that push towards centralization, that push towards co-location and speed. That being said, just the fact that forces exist in the world to push towards speed doesn't mean that we shouldn't design global systems or consider these properties. So this is super important to reason about in your system and makes very intentional trade-off choices. So I'll leave you with this. If you are a consensus researcher and you want to follow my recipe, forget about the BFT model, and let's start talking about the geographic decentralization of various protocols. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have for you today.
Thank you for the talk. I'm wondering how the actual physical nature of the internet informs this concept of geographical distribution, because the internet itself is not uniformly distributed around the globe, and even if you place validators at various points, the traffic might go through Virginia or Frankfurt anyway. So in your opinion, is that studied enough as part of this discussion on decentralization?
In my opinion, that's not studied enough, period, for like all society. I think the internet was not designed with like a lot of intention on a lot of these axes, and I think we're still early in even the research challenges of like the internet impacting society, and we're even starting to see like political issues about like routing and control of various infrastructure and things like that. So yes, in some ways we can only be as decentralized as the actual internet and like in crypto if we're building on top of it, or in any of these games that build on top of the internet. There are already inherent kind of power asymmetries that exist in the internet. In some ways that quotient I said will never be one, because you will always gain something from centralizing a little bit. It's about not kind of pouring fuel on the fire using crypto. But yes, yeah, we also need like a lot more fundamental research into what does that mean for the internet. I have this very troll idea of like, well, maybe if we could find some way to incentivize these two things to align, which is like this decentralization of like the internet routing with the actual decentralization of world power, maybe this starts to solve itself and like the routes get filled in and route more to the right places. I don't know. So yeah, it's a hard question. I don't have a like easy answer for you on it, but it's a great research area.
Thank you.
First off, great talk, appreciated it. Secondly, would proof of work be considered superior to proof of stake for geographic decentralization due to the incentive for decentralization due to varied electricity costs across the globe?
You could make that argument. I think I haven't done like, I think you'd have to probably make some choices in your model, and I don't fully know in my mind whether they all hold or not, but I could see, yeah, it's an interesting argument to explore. I could see the intuition behind it.
Then, hey, sorry to cut you off, but...
the one other thing is like modulo MEV, because MEV kind of like exists in proof of work too and throws a wrench in like a lot of the natural decentralization that happens there, but yeah, you could possibly make the argument.
Do you think that it would be preferable for a proof of stake system to consider a hybrid, like assuming that proof of work is better for decentralization geographically, would it be better to consider a hybrid model or to try to add the same kind of properties to proof of stake through validator reward variance or something?
I think that's like a very interesting, I think it depends on the details, and it's like the system, and it's like somewhat a political question that's above my pay grade because it's about what the community also wants. I think there's also other properties in the system, so this is something I didn't say, which is like geographic decentralization is not the only property people want. You still do want like security and speed and usability, and like, so it's not only about like maximizing this one thing, it's about like just being aware of it in the context of like the many variable optimization problem. So maybe environmental impact is one of those variables, and like that alone means it's not feasible. I don't know.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So you mentioned that there's some trade-offs. I think one of the things we should think about is the decentralization in the builder market. And I think it's very clear that the shorter the block times, the more decentralization we can have in the builder market. Would you agree with that?
No.
I mean, I think it's like very clear that the longer the hang time is, the more like these firms need to have capital available. There's very clearly some blocks that only Beaver has the capital available to like win, and everybody else just doesn't even have enough money in their wallet to like take the size of ARB that they need to take to win the block.
Yeah, I wouldn't project too much out from like the status quo today. Like the capital requirements, for example, in like a decentralized building context, you could have like pretty permissionless capital. So I don't know if that, at least for me, is like a convincing centralizing force, but perhaps, I don't know. I think it's an open research question. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Phil. To your right.
Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. So the slide you had about the SGX versus the MPC part, can you just explain that quickly again?
Yeah,
Like
it's gone, but basically the MPC, it'll require you, when we want to compute a function together, we may have to do many rounds of like back and forth communication or each kind of get information from each other to do the next round. Okay. And the fact that there's a communication or bandwidth overhead versus like in SGX, there's almost no bandwidth overhead. You just have to send this small packet once and then the rest you can perform locally. That means there's like a lot less pressure to optimize your latency essentially.
Okay, but if the FGX are like located in different places, isn't there still like a network latency between them?
Yeah, but you only have to pay that once for a small message versus like, you know, there's like a bottleneck on the speed of the computation that's like directly proportional to like the network. So it's just, it exists, but it's like, it adds like a constant overhead rather than like, you know, like some multiple of that constant overhead that's much bigger.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, Phil. Good talk.
Thank you.
My question is, are you aware of any research done on how do you incentivize geographic decentralization? Because I'd assume in non-leader-based consensus algorithms, everyone would just go closer to the user to minimize latency.
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't thought about, I mean, I've thought about a few like very experimental protocols that are very heavyweight. So like, I had one kind of very early shower experiment like a long time ago in academia, which was like an SGX-based geolocation protocol, and then possibly layering incentives on top of that. If you want to add another buzzword, do that through restaking as like an optional additional subsidy for people where there aren't a lot of nodes. It could be, maybe, I don't know. Like I've thought about it a little, but I wouldn't say, I think it's an underexplored research area and like for sure one of the important things to do. So I don't have an answer there, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question around, so in this design, you're trying to put the game within the protocol. What about the other school of thought where you try to limit the validator or proposer's role as much as you can in the protocol? So these kind of games move outside the protocol. So within protocol design, you don't need to think about these latency problems.
Well, I mean, they still affect the economics of your system. So like the question is like how rich is your model of like expected profit and what does it include? But if it's like substantially rich in like the like you can't ignore anything outside the system. You know, in the real kind of analysis of this. In your model, of course, you can assume things and like ignore things outside the system. But for example, ETH can't reason about like the expected profit of a validator without reasoning about MEV-Boost, which is not in the protocol. So in an L1, you also have to think about what are people going to do not in the protocol that affects the protocol incentives. And so, yes, you can kind of compartmentalize it, which is the approach we've seen like the big L1s take, but you can't really ignore it. You still have to somehow, you know, have some strategy to deal with it.
So the G in the game, that's not just part of the protocol, but it's also like the broader system. So.
I mean, what is and isn't part of the protocol? Like, is MEV-Boost part of the protocol or not? I think it's, you know, I think there's different richnesses of G. I think the most useful G, yeah, includes as much stuff that's economically relevant that's outside the protocol, or at least attempts to model it somehow. There's maybe other more reductive analyses that don't do that, and maybe they're still useful. So it's just a model. It's just about how you set it up, and you know, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, I have a question here. Yeah, so I'm a researcher in the solo staking space, and we have found that, you know, the reason why we still have very centralized staking is because the cloud service in Africa is actually 3 times more expensive than in East Coast America. What do you think the viability of improving the physical infrastructure network, such as providing decentralized database or incentivize solo stakers as a solution to progressive geographical decentralization? And what other solutions do you think might be viable?
I think it's critical, and in fact, like I'm a little bit of an extremist around this. I like went to some unnamed world governments and like lobbied them to build data centers at some point, because I think, you know, data is going to be like kind of the, or not data, but like compute is going to be kind of like the most important, or one of the most important physical resources for like the next 100 years of our civilization, and there is a disproportionate amount of compute in certain hotspots kind of in the world right now. So yeah, I think we will run into this. I think it's like critical that many places kind of reduce this cost and build infra, and possibly even fund this at like the government level as like a subsidy for their society. I don't know how best to incentivize this in the decentralized space. It's a very interesting thing I haven't thought about much, but yeah, I think every country, especially that's not currently like the US, Europe, or China, should build data centers, because otherwise, you know, there's going to be problems in the future. And I think this is true for this, but it's also true for things like AI. So basically, no matter what you think the future holds, like I think this is an independently important research problem. Yeah.